I never thought I'd have to fight for everything I love, but when thieves stormed my family's ranch and stole our horses, they didn't just take animals. They stole a piece of my heart. Now, with only a fierce, untameable stallion by my side, I'm racing against time to bring them home. It's not just about saving the ranch. It's about proving to myself that I'm stronger than they ever believed. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The early morning light poured over Silverbrook Ranch like a warm embrace. I stepped out of the barn, the crisp air filling my lungs as I surveyed the land that had been my family's pride and joy for generations. The fields, golden and soft with dew, stretched as far as the eye could see. To anyone else, it might have seemed idyllic, but to me, it was a reminder of everything I was still trying to prove. "Lila, did you clean out the stalls yet?" My father's voice rang out from the corral, firm and unyielding as always. "I'm on it," I called back, brushing strands of hair from my face. Jonas had run this ranch single-handedly since my mom passed away 2 years ago, and while he never said it outright, I knew he didn't think I had what it took to carry the torch. I tightened my boots and jogged toward the barn. Inside, Shadow stood in his pen, a towering presence of black muscle and barely restrained fury. He pawed at the ground, his dark eyes flashing with distrust. Shadow wasn't just any horse. He was the one my father had reluctantly brought home at a neighbor's auction. No one wanted him. They called him untameable, dangerous even. Jonas had been ready to sell him off the moment Shadow reared, and nearly knocked him over the first day. "This horse will never be of use," he had said with his usual certainty. But something about Shadow resonated with me. Maybe it was the defiance in his eyes, or the scars that hinted at a past full of hardship. I wasn't sure why, but I couldn't bring myself to give up on him. "Morning, Shadow," I murmured, leaning on the edge of the pen. His ears flicked toward me, but his posture stayed rigid. "One day, you'll let someone in. I just know it." "Lila." Jonas's voice snapped me out of my thoughts. "You planning on chatting with that beast all morning, or are you going to get something done?" I sighed, casting one last glance at Shadow before heading back to work. The smell of hay and leather filled the barn as I dragged the muck rake across the stall floor. My hands ached, but I didn't mind. It was the rhythm of ranch life, and for all its demands, it gave me purpose. Jonas was already outside, inspecting the water troughs when I caught up. His weathered face, shadowed by his old cowboy hat, was set in the usual frown that seemed permanently etched there. He didn't say much as I approached, only muttered instructions about the gates and the fence lines. "Storm's moving in later," he said, pointing to the horizon where dark clouds gathered. "Finish up before then." "Yes, Dad." As I worked, my thoughts wandered back to my mom. She had been the heart of this place, the one who saw beauty in the smallest things. Her voice, warm and gentle, lingered in my mind. "Even the wildest hearts can be healed, Lila. You just need patience." I glanced over at Shadow again. He was pacing now, his energy crackling like the storm on the horizon. I wondered if my mom would have seen something in him too, something Jonas and everyone else seemed to miss. As the day wore on, my dad's voice grew sharper. "No, not like that, Lila. Tighten it properly," he said when I fumbled with the saddle strap. His tone wasn't unkind, but it carried the same underlying message. "You're not ready." I bit my lip, forcing myself to hold back a retort. Instead, I focused on finishing the task. The truth was, no matter how hard I worked, it felt like I'd never measure up in his eyes. By the time evening rolled around, I was too tired to care about anything but the chores. But as I walked back toward the barn to check on Shadow one last time, I stopped at the fence. Beyond the fields, the sun dipped low, painting the sky with streaks of gold and crimson. Shadow stood still in his pen, his silhouette stark against the fading light. For a moment, he looked almost calm, his head raised as if watching the sky with me. "Maybe you're just like me," I whispered. "We both have something to prove, don't we?" He snorted, stamping his hoof against the ground. I smiled. One day, Shadow. One day. As the first raindrops began to fall, I turned and headed inside, bracing myself for another day of trying to prove that I belonged here. The storm hit harder than anyone expected. Sheets of rain lashed against the barn walls as thunder rolled across the fields. I tossed in my bed, unable to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. Something wasn't right. Shadow had been restless earlier, pawing and snorting more than usual. He always reacted to storms, but this time felt different. I couldn't put my finger on why. Then it happened, the barking. It started low, the ranch dogs growling in the distance, but within seconds their sharp, frantic barks filled the night. My heart jumped, and I bolted upright. Lightning flashed, illuminating the room in a blinding white glare, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement outside the window.
Dad.
I yelled, scrambling to pull on my boots. Something's happening. I dashed downstairs, my pulse pounding. Jonas met me at the door, his expression grim. He held the old shotgun that usually sat above the fireplace, but his hand trembled as he opened the door to peer out into the storm. What in the— His words were cut off by the sound of shouts and hoofbeats. My stomach dropped as I stepped outside. Figures moved through the rain, shadows darting between the corral and the trailers parked just beyond the barn. Horses, Jonas growled. They're taking the horses. Without thinking, I grabbed a flashlight from the porch and sprinted toward the chaos. Moonlight. I shouted, my voice barely audible over the storm. The rain stung my face as I ran toward the corral. Lightning lit up the scene for a split second, and what I saw made my blood boil. 3 masked men were wrangling the horses, forcing them into the back of a trailer. Moonlight reared, her white coat glistening under the rain, but a thick rope around her neck kept her from breaking free. Get away from them, Jonas roared, limping forward with the shotgun raised.
Dad, wait.
I screamed, but he was already charging ahead. One of the thieves turned, swinging a metal bar, and the sound of the impact made my stomach lurch. Jonas collapsed to the ground, clutching his side.
Dad.
I rushed to his side, but before I could reach him, one of the thieves shoved me down into the mud. My flashlight flew out of my hand, its beam casting a weak, spinning light across the corral. Stay back. The man snarled, towering over me. Helpless, I could only watch as they dragged Moonlight into the trailer. Her cries tore through the night, a haunting, desperate sound that shattered what little composure I had left.
No.
I screamed, struggling to get up, but the thief shoved me back down. In the chaos, I heard a familiar, feral sound, Shadow. He was in his pen, thrashing and kicking against the fence. His wild snorts and stomps were louder than the storm, and for a moment, the thieves hesitated. One of them glanced toward the black stallion, muttering something to his partner. Leave that one, the leader barked. He's not worth it. I felt a flash of relief, but it was fleeting. By the time I pulled myself to my knees, the thieves were already climbing into the truck. The engine roared to life, and the tires spun in the mud as they sped off, the trailer rattling behind them. As the taillights disappeared into the night, the ranch fell eerily silent. The aftermath felt surreal. I knelt beside Jonas, shaking him gently. His face was pale, and his breathing was labored, but he waved me off. I'm fine, he muttered, though the pain in his voice was unmistakable. You're not fine, I said, choking back tears. We need to get you inside. He didn't argue as I helped him to his feet. The rain had eased to a drizzle by the time we reached the house, but my clothes were soaked, and mud clung to every inch of me. Once Jonas was settled on the couch, I grabbed a first aid kit and inspected his injury. A nasty bruise was already forming on his ribs, but nothing seemed broken. Just a scratch, he said gruffly, though his wince told me otherwise. I've had worse. I sat back, exhausted and overwhelmed. The image of Moonlight being dragged into the trailer played over and over in my mind. They took her, I whispered, my voice breaking. They took Moonlight. And the others. Jonas didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his tone was heavy with defeat. "This is my fault," he said. "I should have been ready for something like this. Should have kept better security." "It's not your fault," I said, though the words felt hollow. Deep down, I blamed myself. I should have done more, should have fought harder. Jonas leaned his head back against the couch, closing his eyes. "Call the sheriff in the morning. Let them handle it."
His words felt like a slap.
Let them handle it? These weren't just animals, they were family. Moonlight wasn't just a horse. She was a piece of my mom, a reminder of everything we'd built here. And yet, as much as I wanted to argue, I couldn't find the words. Later that night, I stood by the window, staring out at the empty corral. The rain had stopped, but the damage was done. Shadow paced in his pen, his movements sharp and agitated. He looked toward the house, his dark eyes gleaming under the moonlight. It was almost as if he knew what had happened, as if he could feel the weight of the loss just as much as I did. "I should have done something," I whispered. The words hung in the air, unanswered, as the night stretched on. The next morning, the ranch felt like a ghost town. The usual sounds of whinnying and hooves stamping in the corral were gone, replaced by an eerie silence that settled over everything. I stood at the edge of the pen, staring at the empty spaces where Moonlight and the others used to roam. Jonas was still recovering inside the house, leaving me alone with my thoughts. My body ached from the events of the night before, but the knot in my chest hurt worse.
"I'm sorry, Moonlight. Imermerd."
Shadow paced in his pen, restless as ever. He snorted and tossed his head, pawing at the ground with an intensity that mirrored my frustration. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, as if he expected me to do something. But what could I do? I turned back to the corral, kicking at the mud near the broken fence. That's when I saw it, a scrap of fabric, torn and stuck to the jagged edge of the splintered wood. I crouched down and picked it up, holding it between my fingers. The fabric was black, rough to the touch, with a faint emblem stitched into the corner. A winged horse encircled by faded lettering. A shiver ran through me. The emblem looked familiar, though I couldn't place it right away. Then I remembered overhearing a conversation at the general store a few weeks ago. A rancher had mentioned a group of horse traffickers operating in the region, professionals who stole animals and sold them to buyers out of state. Could this be connected to them? Shadow let out a loud snort, breaking my train of thought. I turned to look at him, and for a moment, it felt like he was urging me forward, pushing me to act. "I don't know what to do," I said aloud, clutching the fabric tightly. I felt small and helpless, like a child pretending to be brave. What could I possibly do against a gang of thieves? The sheriff might investigate, but I knew it wouldn't be fast enough. By the time they tracked down the trailer, Moonlight and the others would be long gone. My chest tightened at the thought of her soft white coat, the way she nickered when I scratched behind her ears. I couldn't let her disappear. I wouldn't. Back inside the house, Jonas was sitting at the kitchen table, his expression hard and distant. The coffee mug in his hand looked out of place, as if it belonged to someone who could relax, someone who wasn't watching their entire life fall apart. "I found this," I said, placing the fabric on the table in front of him. Jonas glanced at it briefly before turning away. "So?" "I think it's from the thieves," I said, trying to keep the urgency out of my voice. "Look at the emblem. It matches the description of that gang people talk about, the horse traffickers." Jonas sighed, setting his mug down. "Lila, we don't know that for sure. And even if it is, what do you think you're going to do about it?" His words stung, but I forced myself to stand my ground. "We can't just sit here and wait. By the time the sheriff does anything, they'll be gone.
We have to act now."
"No," Jonas said firmly, his voice low but unyielding. "It's too dangerous. These men aren't just thieves, they're criminals. They're armed, and they won't think twice about hurting someone who gets in their way." "But they took everything, Dad," I said, my voice rising. "Moonlight.
Star.
The others. Mom's horses. How can we just let them go?" Jonas leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, they were softer, filled with a mix of exhaustion and guilt.
I'm sorry, Lila.
I know how much this hurts.
But you have to be smart about this.
Let the sheriff handle it. I turned away, my hands trembling. Every instinct in me screamed to fight back, to do something, anything, but Jonas's words hung over me like a heavy weight. Let it go, he said quietly. But I couldn't. Later that afternoon, I stood by Shadow's pen, watching him pace back and forth. The fabric scrap was tucked in my pocket, a reminder of everything that had been stolen. Shadow stopped and turned to face me, his dark eyes locking onto mine. There was something different about him, something I couldn't explain. He wasn't just wild or angry, he was waiting, ready for something. You're just like me, aren't you? Everyone thinks we're not good enough. They think we can't handle it. But they're wrong. Shadow snorted, stamping his hoof. A spark lit inside me, small but undeniable. I couldn't sit by and watch everything my family had built disappear. If no one else would act, then I would. That night, as the stars blinked faintly through the remnants of the storm clouds, I made my decision. I didn't know how, but I was going to find those horses. I glanced toward Shadow one last time before heading inside. His dark silhouette stood motionless against the moonlight, his presence steady and strong. "We'll show them," I whispered. And for the first time in days, I felt hope. The next morning, I stood by Shadow's pen, gripping the wooden fence, as if it could somehow steady my nerves. The air was cool and sharp, the kind of morning where your breath fogged in front of you. Shadow stood in his usual spot, his dark coat gleaming in the early light, his ears flicking at the sound of every rustle of wind.
Today was different, though.
I wasn't just here to watch him or murmur encouragement. Today, I was going to try to reach him, to turn the untameable stallion into my partner. I had no choice. "You don't trust anyone, do you?" I asked softly, resting my chin on my hands. Shadow turned his head, his eyes flashing, as if he understood. Jonas's warnings echoed in my head. He's dangerous. Leave him be. But Jonas wasn't here, and I needed Shadow. I needed him to help me find Moonlight and the others. Taking a deep breath, I opened the gate and stepped inside. Shadow immediately tensed, his ears pinning back. "Easy," I said, keeping my voice steady. I held out my hand, palm up, showing him the apple I'd brought from the kitchen. His nostrils flared, but he didn't move. I took a single step closer, then stopped. "Look, I'm not here to hurt you," I murmured. "We're on the same side. You want to run, don't you? You're just waiting for someone to let you." Shadow's muscles coiled, his head tossing back as he snorted loudly. I stayed still, lowering my hand slightly. My heart raced, but I didn't let it show. "It's okay," I whispered. "Take your time." The next few hours passed in silence, broken only by the soft shuffle of hooves on dirt. Shadow didn't come closer, but he didn't bolt either. That alone felt like progress. When the sun began to rise higher, I stepped back, leaving the apple on the ground. "We'll try again tomorrow," I said, more to myself than to him.
And we did.
Every morning, I showed up with a calm voice and a treat in hand. At first, Shadow ignored me, his gaze sharp and wary. But over time, something began to shift. On the third day, he took a cautious step forward. My breath hitched, and I froze, afraid of startling him. His nose brushed the apple in my hand, then quickly pulled away. "You're okay?" I whispered, my voice trembling with relief. "You're okay." By the end of the week, Shadow was letting me approach without backing away. I didn't try to rush it. Every movement was deliberate, every word soft. It wasn't just about taming him, it was about understanding him. I could see it in his eyes. The same defiance I felt, the same fear of letting someone in. One afternoon, I brought a brush into the pen. Shadow watched me warily as I approached. "Just a brush," I said, holding it up for him to see. "Nothing scary." He didn't move as I stepped closer, though his muscles stayed tense. I reached out, slowly and carefully, until the brush touched his side. For a moment he flinched. Then, to my astonishment, he relaxed. "That's it," I murmured, stroking the brush along his sleek coat.
See?
Not so bad. The rhythmic motion was soothing for both of us, I realized. For the first time in days, I felt the weight on my chest start to lift. By the time a week had passed, Shadow and I had built a fragile trust. He would let me lead him with a rope, though he still snorted and stomped if I moved too quickly. I started practicing in the open field, testing his speed and strength. He was fast, faster than I expected, his hooves pounding the ground like thunder. "Good boy," I called, a grin spreading across my face as we completed our first successful run. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. One afternoon, as I tried to guide him over a small obstacle, he reared back, nearly pulling the rope from my hands.
Whoa.
I shouted, stumbling to keep my footing. "It's okay," I said, keeping my voice calm. "We'll try again later." His reactions weren't out of malice. I could see that now. They came from fear, from whatever had happened to him before he came to us. As the days went on, I started to see glimpses of the horse he could be. The fire in his eyes wasn't just wildness, it was strength, determination. And for the first time, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could do this. One morning, as I fastened a saddle to his back, I caught Jonas watching from the porch. His face was hard to read, but I thought I saw a flicker of something, pride, maybe. "You're wasting your time," he called, though his tone lacked its usual bite. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Shadow shifted under the saddle, but he didn't bolt. I gave him a reassuring pat. "Ready?" I asked, climbing into the saddle. He snorted, pawing at the ground. Taking a deep breath, I nudged him forward. His muscles coiled, and then we were moving, fast and smooth, the wind rushing past us. It felt like freedom, like a promise that we were finally on the same page. As we slowed to a stop, I leaned forward, resting my hand on his neck. "Thank you," I whispered. For the first time, Shadow didn't pull away. That night, as I sat on the porch watching the stars, I felt something I hadn't felt in days. Hope. Shadow wasn't just a horse anymore. He was my partner, my ally. And together, we were going to bring moonlight home. The mountains loomed ahead, their jagged peaks slicing into the pale morning sky. Shadow and I had been riding since dawn, following a trail of hoof prints and broken branches that seemed almost too obvious to be real. My stomach churned at the thought. It could easily be a trap, but I pushed the fear aside. I had no choice. Shadow's ears flicked back and forth as we moved deeper into the wilderness. His muscles coiled and uncoiled beneath me, ready to react at the first sign of danger. I rested a hand on his neck, murmuring softly, "We've got this. Just keep going." The fabric scrap with the winged horse emblem was tucked safely into my jacket pocket, a constant reminder of the stakes. It was more than a clue, it was a thread tying me to the thieves who had taken Moonlight and the others. We came to a steep incline, the dirt loose and rocky. Shadow hesitated, his hooves shifting beneath him as he searched for footing. "You can do this," I said, leaning forward slightly to ease the weight on his back. He snorted, then surged forward, his powerful legs propelling us up the hill. The climb was brutal, but when we reached the top, the view was breathtaking. The valley below stretched wide and green, dotted with thick patches of forest. But it wasn't the beauty of the scene that caught my attention. It was the trail. Deep grooves cut into the dirt, parallel tracks from the wheels of a trailer. I dismounted and crouched to inspect them. They were fresh, the edges still sharp from where the weight of the tires had pressed into the ground. "They're close," I whispered, my pulse quickening. We pressed on, the trail growing narrower as it wound through the trees. Branches clawed at my arms, and Shadow moved cautiously, his steps deliberate. Every sound, a rustle in the underbrush, the distant call of a bird, set my nerves on edge. After hours of riding, I spotted something glinting in the dirt. Sliding off Shadow's back, I crouched to pick it up. It was a rope, frayed and streaked with mud, as if it had been hastily discarded. A chill ran down my spine. This was it. This was the proof I needed to know I was on the right track. Almost there, I murmured to Shadow, slipping the rope into my saddlebag. He huffed softly, his breath steaming in the cool air. It was late afternoon when we reached the edge of the camp. I pulled Shadow to a halt, sliding off his back and crouching low behind a cluster of bushes. From our vantage point, I could see everything: a small clearing tucked into the base of the mountains, where a trailer sat parked alongside a makeshift corral. Inside the pen, the stolen horses milled about, their movements slow and subdued. My breath caught when I spotted Moonlight. She stood apart from the others, her white coat dulled with dirt, her head hanging low. "I'm here," I whispered, my throat tightening. "I'll get you out of this." The camp wasn't large, but it wasn't empty either. 3 men sat around a fire, their voices low and gruff. Another 2 were near the corral, inspecting the ropes that held the horses in place. 5 of them. 5 against me. I bit my lip, my mind racing. A direct confrontation was out of the question. I had to be smart, and I had to be quick. I spent the next hour watching, counting the men and studying their movements. The ones by the fire seemed relaxed, laughing and passing a bottle between them. The 2 near the corral were more alert, their eyes scanning the area every so often. Shadow shifted behind me, his body tense. I reached back to place a hand on his neck. "Not yet," I whispered. "We need the right moment." As the sun began to set, the camp grew quieter. The men by the fire seemed to lose focus, their laughter fading into tired murmurs. The 2 near the corral moved toward the trailer, leaving the horses momentarily unattended. This was it. "Okay, Shadow," I whispered, turning to him. "This is where we need to be brave." I slipped off his bridle and stroked his nose. "I need you to create a distraction. Make them chase you, but stay safe. You hear me? No being a hero." Shadow snorted softly, as if he understood. Taking a deep breath, I slapped his flank and whispered, "Go." He shot out of the bushes like an arrow, his powerful hooves pounding the ground. The men by the fire scrambled to their feet, shouting in alarm. "Loose horse." The 2 near the trailer grabbed for ropes, but Shadow was too fast. He darted between them, kicking over a pile of crates and sending supplies scattering across the clearing. Chaos erupted. The gate was secured with a rusty chain, but my hands were steady as I worked to undo it. "Easy, girl," I whispered to Moonlight, who perked up at the sound of my voice. The chain fell away with a clink, and I swung the gate open. "Come on," I said, urging her forward. The other horses followed, their hooves soft against the dirt. But just as we started to move, one of the men turned and spotted us. "Hey, stop her." My heart leapt into my throat. The man started toward me, but before he could get close, a black blur shot between us. Shadow. He charged at the man, forcing him to stumble back. His hooves struck the ground with a force that made the earth tremble, and his wild snorting sent the man running. "Good boy," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. With Shadow guarding our escape, I led the horses into the trees. My chest heaved with relief as the camp faded behind us, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter with every step. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe we might actually make it. The trees closed in around us, their dark shapes casting long shadows under the faint moonlight. I led Moonlight carefully through the underbrush, her hooves crunching softly against the forest floor. Shadow lingered behind us, his ears swiveling at every sound. The other horses followed in a loose line, their movements slow and hesitant. I whispered soft reassurances, hoping to keep them calm, but my heart was pounding too hard to sound convincing. We hadn't gone far before the shouting started behind us. "There, they're getting away." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The thieves were closer than I thought. Their voices carried through the still night, harsh and frantic, the unmistakable sound of panic turning into anger. Shadow snorted, pawing the ground as if ready to charge back toward the noise. I placed a hand on his neck, whispering, "No, not yet. We need to keep moving." Urging Moonlight forward, I picked up the pace, leading the group toward a narrow path I'd scouted earlier. The trail wound through the forest, treacherous with loose rocks and steep drops, but it was our only chance. The sounds of pursuit grew louder. We reached the edge of a ravine, the path narrowing dangerously. The drop to my right was steep, disappearing into a black void that made my stomach twist. I turned to the horses, trying to keep my voice steady.
Easy now.
One at a time. Moonlight went first, her steps careful and deliberate. The other horses followed, their hooves dislodging small rocks that tumbled into the abyss below. I glanced back to check on Shadow, but he was already moving, his dark shape blending into the night. Halfway across, I heard the snap of a branch behind us. My head whipped around, and there they were, the thieves, emerging from the trees, their flashlights bouncing wildly in the dark. "There they are," one of them shouted. Panic surged through me. "Hurry," I urged the horses, my voice sharp and desperate. Moonlight picked up her pace, but the trail was too narrow to run. The other horses hesitated, sensing the danger in the air. "Move," I yelled, clapping my hands to spur them on. Shadow turned abruptly, positioning himself between the group and the thieves. His body was tense, his ears pinned back. "What are you doing?" I whispered, my chest tightening. One of the men stepped closer, raising a rope in his hand. "Get that black one," he barked. But Shadow didn't wait for them to act. With a loud snort, he reared up, his hooves slicing through the air before crashing down with a force that echoed through the ravine. The men stumbled back, their shouts turning into curses as they tried to regroup. "Go, Shadow," I called, tears stinging my eyes. "Get out of there." But he didn't leave. Shadow charged at the men, his massive body cutting through the darkness like a force of nature. One of them tried to throw the rope, but Shadow dodged it easily, his movements sharp and precise. The sheer power of his presence seemed to overwhelm them. They scrambled to retreat, tripping over rocks and each other in their haste to get away. "Come on," I yelled to the horses, tugging gently on Moonlight's reins. The rest of the group followed me across the trail, their fear driving them forward. My pulse thundered in my ears as we finally reached the other side of the ravine. I turned to look back, my heart pounding. Shadow stood at the edge of the trail, staring down the men who had dared to follow us. "Shadow," I whispered, my voice breaking. For a moment, he was still, his dark silhouette framed by the faint glow of the thieves' flashlights. Then, as if satisfied that they wouldn't dare come any closer, he turned and trotted back toward me. I sank to my knees as he approached, wrapping my arms around his neck. "Thank you," I murmured, my tears soaking into his mane. "You saved us." He stood still, his breath heavy and warm against my shoulder. For the first time, I felt like we weren't just two separate beings. We were a team, united by a shared fight. The thieves didn't pursue us again. Shadow's display of strength had been enough to break their resolve, and their shouts faded into the distance as we pressed on. The trail eventually opened into a wide clearing where I stopped to let the horses rest. Moonlight leaned against me, her exhaustion clear in the way her head drooped. "You're okay now," I whispered, running my hand along her neck. "We're almost home." Shadow stood watch a few feet away, his body still alert. Even now, after everything he'd done, he seemed ready for another fight. But we were safe for now. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I led the group toward the faint outline of the ranch in the distance. The stolen horses moved in a slow but steady line, their hooves kicking up soft clouds of dust. Shadow stayed close to me, his presence steady and reassuring. And for the first time in days, I allowed myself to believe that everything might actually be okay. The ranch appeared through the morning haze like a dream. The rising sun bathed the fields in soft amber light, and the sight of the corral fence, still standing despite everything, filled me with a rush of relief so overwhelming, I could barely breathe. Moonlight nudged my shoulder, her soft wicker grounding me in the moment. I turned to look at the horses trailing behind us. Their coats were dusty, their movement slow, But they were alive, and they were home. Shadow stood to the side, his black coat gleaming in the early light. He had been my constant strength through it all, and now, as we approached the ranch, he seemed to relax for the first time, his ears swiveling lazily. "We did it," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "We really did it." Jonas was waiting for me at the edge of the corral. He leaned heavily on his cane, his face etched with worry. At first, he squinted into the distance, his expression unreadable. But as we drew closer, his eyes widened and his jaw slackened in disbelief. The ranch dogs barked excitedly, running ahead to greet us. I dismounted and waved, my arm weak and trembling.
"Dad."
Jonas limped forward, his gaze shifting from me to the horses behind me, then to Shadow, who followed closely at my side. For a long moment he said nothing. Then his voice broke the silence, low and filled with emotion. "You brought them back." I ran to him, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. Before I could say a word, Jonas wrapped me in an embrace, his arms strong despite his injuries. It was the first time in years he'd held me like that, and I felt a knot of emotion unravel in my chest. "I thought I lost you," he murmured, his voice rough. "I thought." "You didn't," I said quickly, pulling back to look at him. "We're okay. Moonlight's okay." Shadow. I turned to glance at the stallion, who stood calmly a few feet away. "He's the reason we made it." Jonas's gaze lingered on Shadow, his face softening in a way I hadn't seen before. "That horse," he shook his head, his voice trailing off. "He's not just a horse," I said firmly. "He's family." Jonas nodded slowly, his hand resting on my shoulder. "You proved me wrong, Lila," he said, his voice quieter now. "I didn't think you could handle this, didn't think anyone could. But you did. You brought them home." The weight of his words hit me like a flood. For so long, I'd been fighting to prove myself, to show Jonas that I was capable. And now, in this moment, I realized something. It had never been about proving myself to him, it had been about proving it to myself. As we led the horses back into the corral, neighbors began to arrive, drawn by the commotion. Word of the theft had spread quickly, and now they stared in awe as the stolen horses filed into the pen. "That's Moonlight," someone exclaimed, "and Star. I can't believe it." Another person pointed at Shadow, their voice tinged with wonder. "Isn't that the black stallion everyone said was wild? How'd she manage to tame him?" I didn't answer, but I felt a swell of pride as Shadow stood beside me, his head held high. That afternoon, as we worked to settle the horses and repair the corral, Jonas pulled me aside. He leaned on his cane, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said, "I always thought strength was about control, about being tough enough to handle whatever came your way. But watching you," he trailed off, shaking his head, "I see now that strength is about heart. And you've got more of that than I ever gave you credit for." I blinked back tears, unable to speak. Jonas reached out and rested his hand on my shoulder. "Your mother would have been so proud of you," he said softly. The mention of her hit me hard, but in a good way. For the first time since she'd passed, I felt like I was living up to the person she believed I could be. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch, I found myself standing by Shadow's pen. He watched me quietly, his dark eyes steady and unguarded. "Thank you," I whispered, reaching out to stroke his muzzle. "I couldn't have done it without you." Shadow leaned into my hand, his breath warm against my palm. It was a simple gesture, but it meant the world to me. We had faced the storm together, and now we were home. The ranch was quiet that night. The stars hung low in the sky, their soft light spilling over the fields and casting gentle shadows across the corral. The horses were settled, their movements slow and peaceful, as if they, too, could finally rest. I stood by the porch, wrapped in my mother's old shawl. It still smelled faintly of lavender, and I pulled it closer, feeling her presence in the cool night air. The events of the past few days were a blur, a whirlwind of fear, determination, and, somehow, triumph. I glanced toward the barn, where Shadow stood in his pen. He had his head lowered, nibbling at a patch of hay. His black coat shimmered under the moonlight, and I felt a surge of gratitude so deep it brought tears to my eyes. We had done it. Against all odds, we had brought them home. Jonas joined me on the porch, his step slow but steady as he leaned on his cane. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside me, his gaze fixed on the corral. I always thought running this ranch was about being the strongest, he said finally, his voice low. Thought if I could just keep things under control, nothing would fall apart. He shook his head, a faint, rueful smile on his face. But I was wrong. It's not about control. It's about heart, and you've got more of that than I ever imagined. His words hung in the air, soft and unexpected. I blinked, my throat tightening as I struggled to find a response. Thanks, Dad. I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. Jonas nodded, his gaze shifting to Shadow. And that horse, he said, his tone lighter now. He's something else. Never thought I'd see the day anyone could tame him. He's not tame, I said, smiling despite myself. He just decided to trust me. Jonas chuckled. Sounds like someone else I know. Later, as the ranch settled into a deep, comforting silence, I wandered out to Shadow's pen. He raised his head as I approached, his ears flicking forward. Hey, big guy, I said softly, resting my arms on the fence. He stepped closer, his dark eyes meeting mine. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the weight of everything we'd been through resting between us. I know you didn't have to stay, I murmured. Back there with the thieves, you could have run. But you didn't. You stayed. Shadow leaned his head against me, his breath warm against my shoulder. My chest tightened, and I felt tears slip down my cheeks. You're more than just a horse, I whispered. You're family. And I promise, I'll never let anyone take that away again. The next morning, I found myself back in the barn, cleaning out Shadow's stall. The work felt easier now, lighter somehow, as if the ranch itself had started to heal. As I swept, something caught my eye, a small scrap of fabric tucked under the hay. I bent down to pick it up, my fingers brushing over the familiar texture. It was black, frayed at the edges, with the same winged horse emblem stitched into the corner. A chill ran through me. What was this doing here? Had it been here all along unnoticed? Or had Shadow brought it here from somewhere else? I stared at the fabric, my mind racing. It didn't make sense, but deep down I knew it was no coincidence. Shadow's past was still a mystery, one I wasn't sure I was ready to unravel. By evening, the ranch was alive with quiet activity. The neighbors had come to help repair the fences and clear away the last remnants of the storm. Moonlight trotted across the field, her movements smooth and full of the grace I thought we'd lost forever. Shadow stood near the edge of the corral, watching the other horses with an intensity one couldn't quite read. He didn't need to be in the spotlight, he never did. But I knew that every step forward we took was because of him. That night, as snow began to fall in soft, delicate flakes, Jonas and I sat by the fire. The warmth filled the room, chasing away the last traces of the cold. You've grown up so much, Jonas said, breaking the comfortable silence. Your mom, she'd be proud of you. Tears welled in my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. Instead, I smiled, clutching the edge of my shawl. She taught me everything I needed to know, I said softly. You've got her strength, you know.
And you've got mine too.
Before bed, I stepped out onto the porch one last time. The snow blanketed the ranch, soft and quiet, as if the world itself had paused to breathe. I looked toward the sky, the stars winking faintly through the falling flakes. Thank you, Mom, I whispered. Shadow's dark silhouette moved in the corral, his head lifting toward the stars as if he, too, was looking for something. And in that moment, I knew we were both exactly where we were meant to be.